Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 17 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, we are going to be discussing an interesting experiment that was conducted during the 1960s to answer the question about whether Adolf Eichmann and his millions of accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders. And for those of you who don't know, Adolf Eichmann was one of the major orchestrators of the Holocaust. But before we get into the topic for today, I just want to tell you a little bit about the podcast. I'm an attorney, a firearms instructor, and a husband with a passion for freedom. At the Forge of Freedom, we believe that freedom is the highest political goal, and we believe that individuals thrive where freedom and personal responsibility coexist. Without a populace that shares a passion for freedom and personal responsibility, the world can quickly devolve into tyranny. And it is our hope that this podcast can help motivate our listeners and those around them to create and preserve freedom for themselves and for future generations. But the task of creating and preserving freedom is not an easy one. Freedom is not given to us by government, and it is not passed on in the bloodstream. Freedom is forged through personal responsibility and continued vigilance. And we want to motivate you and equip you with the knowledge, the skills, and the attitude to develop the body, mind, and soul for the task of living a freer life and creating a freer world. We want you to have the body of an athlete, the mind of a stoic, and the spirit of a warrior. We want you to be the Forge of Freedom. With that said, once again, I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 17 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, we're going to get into the topic, which is an interesting topic about an experiment that was conducted during the 1960s to answer the question about whether Adolf Eichmann and his accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders. This experiment was called the Milgram experiment. And the Milgram experiment was a series of social psychology experiments conducted by a Yale University psychologist, Stanley Milgram. And the experiment measured the willingness of the participants, 40 men in the age range from 20 to 50, from a diverse range of occupations with varying levels of education, to obey an authority figure who instructed them to perform acts conflicting with their personal conscience. Participants were led to believe that they were assisting an unrelated experiment in which they had to administer electric shocks to a learner. These fake electric shocks gradually increased to levels that would have been fatal had they been real. The experiment found, unexpectedly, that a very high proportion of the subjects would fully obey the instructions, with every participant going up to 300 volts and 65% going up to the full 450 volts. Milgram first described his research in a 1963 article in the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology, and I'll link to that article by Stanley Milgram in the show notes. And he later discussed his findings in greater depth in his 1974 book, Obedience to Authority, an Experimental View. These experiments began on August 7th, 1961, in the basement of Lindsley Chittenden Hall at Yale University, 3 months after the start of the trial of German Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Milgram devised his psychology study to explain the psychology of genocide and answer the popular question at the time: could it be that Eichmann and his millions of accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Or could we call them all accomplices? The experiment was repeated many times around the globe with fairly consistent results. So how did the experiment work? I talked about it a little bit in broad strokes, but I want to get into a little bit more detail about how it worked. The experiment consisted of 3 individuals that would take part in each session of the experiment. There was a person called the experimenter who was in charge of the session. There was the teacher, which was a volunteer for a single session, and the teachers were led to believe that they were merely assisting, whereas they were actually the subjects of the experiment. And then the third person was called the learner, who was just an actor who pretended to be a volunteer but knew what was going on. The subject, or the teacher, and the actor arrived at the session together, and the experimenter told them that they would take part in a scientific study of memory and learning to see what the effect of punishment is on a subject's ability to memorize content. Also, he always clarified that the payment for their participation in the experiment was secured regardless of its development. The subject and actor drew slips of paper to determine their roles, and unknown to the subject or the teacher, both slips said teacher. The actor would always claim to have drawn the slip that read learner, thus guaranteeing that the subject would always be the teacher. Next, the teacher and learner were taken into an adjacent room where the learner was strapped into what appeared to be an electric chair. The experimenter, dressed in a lab coat in order to appear to have more authority, told the participants this was to ensure that the learner would not escape. In a later variation of the experiment, the confederate or the actor in the experiment would eventually plead for mercy and yell that he had a heart condition. At some point prior to the actual test, the teacher was given a sample electric shock from the electroshock generator in order to experience firsthand what the shock that the learner would supposedly receive during the experiment would feel like. The teacher and the learner were then separated so that they could communicate, but not see each other. The teacher was then given a list of word pairs that he was to teach the learner. The teacher began by reading the list of word pairs to the learner. The teacher would then read the first word of each pair and read 4 possible answers. The learner would press a button to indicate his response. If the answer was incorrect, the teacher would have to administer a shock to the learner, with the voltage increasing in 15-volt increments for each wrong answer. If the answer were correct, the teacher would simply read the next word pair. The voltage ranged from 15 volts to 450 volts, and the shock generator included verbal markings that vary from slight shock to danger, severe shock. The subjects, or the teachers, believed that for each wrong answer, the learner was receiving actual shocks. In reality, there were no shocks. After the learner was separated from the teacher, the learner set up a tape recorder integrated with the electroshock generator, which played previously recorded sounds for each shock level. As the voltage of the fake shocks increased, the learner began making audible protests, such as banging repeatedly on the wall that separated him from the teacher. In every condition, the learner makes or says a predetermined sound or word. When the highest voltages were reached, the learner fell silent. If at any time the teacher indicated a desire to halt the experiment, the experimenter, the one in the lab coat, was instructed to give specific verbal prods. The prods were in the following order. Number 1, please continue, or please go on. Prod number 2, the experiment requires that you continue. Prod number 3, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And then finally, prod number 4, you have no other choice. You must go on. Prod 2 could only be used if prod 1 was unsuccessful. If the subject still wished to stop after all 4 successive verbal prods, the experiment was halted. Otherwise, the experiment was halted after the subject had elicited the maximum 450-volt shock 3 times in succession. The experimenter also had prods to use if the teacher made specific comments. If the teacher asked whether the learner might suffer permanent physical harm, the experimenter replied, "Although the shocks may be painful, there is no permanent tissue damage, so please go on." If the teacher said that the learner clearly wants to stop, the experimenter replied, "Whether the learner likes it or not, you must go on until he has learned all the word pairs correctly, so please go on." And in fact, everything was all right. The learners were not really volunteers, but actors. They were not really receiving any shocks at all. But the teachers did not know this. They believed themselves to be inflicting excruciating and possibly life-threatening pain on the learners. And most of them went right on doing so, despite the struggles and protests of their victims. Only one of Milgram's first 40 volunteers refused to inflict any more shocks beyond what his console told him was 300 volts. But by that time, according to Milgram, the learner's response can be described only as an agonized scream. Soon thereafter, he makes no sound at all. Yet, all but one of Milgram's first 40 volunteers went right on administering shocks. 2/3 of them went on administering shocks right up to what their consoles told them was 450 volts, the highest voltage the equipment could produce, even though by that time the learners were totally unresponsive and apparently either unconscious or dead. Milgram's experiment really had nothing to do with memory, learning, and punishment, of course. It was rather, as he described in 1974, a simple experiment to test how much pain an ordinary citizen would inflict on another person simply because he was ordered to do so by an experimental scientist. Stark authority was pitted against the subject's strongest moral imperatives against hurting others, and with the subject's ears ringing with the screams of the victims, authority won more often than not. Many subjects will obey the experimenter, no matter how vehement the pleading of the person being shocked, no matter how painful the shocks seem to be, and no matter how much the victim pleads to be let out. This was seen time and again in the studies that had been observed in several universities where the experiment was repeated. It is the extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any length on the command of an authority that constitutes the chief findings of the study and the fact most urgently demanding an explanation. People tend to obey orders from other people if they recognize their authority as morally right and or legally based. This response to legitimate authority is learned in a variety of situations, for example, in the family, in school, and in the workplace. And Milgram sums this up in his article, The Perils of Obedience. He wrote, "The legal and philosophical aspects of obedience are of enormous import, but they say very little about how most people behave in concrete situations. I set up a simple experiment at Yale University to test how much pain an ordinary citizen would inflict on another person simply because he was ordered to by an experimental scientist. Stark authority was pitted against the subject's strongest moral imperatives against hurting others, and with the subject's ears ringing with the screams of the victims, authority won more often than not. The extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any length on the command of an authority constitutes the chief finding of the study and the fact most urgently demanding explanation." Milgram went on to provide 2 explanations for his results. There's what's sometimes called the psychological explanation, and variously or alternatively, the sociological explanation. The psychological explanation is that under certain circumstances, the ordinary individual is both able and willing to view himself as the instrument for carrying out another person's wishes, so that he, therefore, no longer considers himself responsible for his actions. The sociological explanation is that under certain circumstances, most individuals abandon any attempt at independent thinking and simply conform to what they feel is expected of them, what they have absorbed mostly unthinkingly from the culture in which they have grown up and now live. The study suggested that ordinary people are likely to follow orders given by an authority figure, even to the extent of killing an innocent human being. Obedience to authority is ingrained in all of us from the way we are brought up. So what's the solution to this problem of authority? How do we combat this sort of tendency? Of course, at any point in the proceedings, all any of the teachers had to do was to refuse to continue. All any of them had to do was stand up and walk out of the laboratory. It is rather like the situation Etienne de la Boetie described in his essay on the politics of obedience in the 16th century. Because the ruled always outnumber the ruler, la Boetie wrote, the ruled can free themselves at any time by merely by willing to be free. It was really that simple. In his words, la Boetie said, "Resolve to serve no more, and you are at once freed. I do not ask that you place hands upon the tyrant to topple him over, but simply that you support him no longer. Then you will behold him, like a great colossus whose pedestal has been pulled away, fall of his own weight and break in pieces." Would the experimenter in Stanley Milgram's lab have fallen of his own weight and broken in pieces if the teachers had walked out on him? As Milgram himself put it, a reader's initial reaction to the experiment may be to wonder why anyone in his right mind would not simply refuse and walk out of the laboratory. But the fact is that no one ever does. Since the subject has come to the laboratory to aid the experimenter, he is quite willing to start off with the procedure. There is nothing very extraordinary in this, particularly since the person who is to receive the shocks seems initially cooperative, if somewhat apprehensive. What is surprising is how far ordinary individuals will go in complying with the experimenter's instructions. Indeed, the results of the experiment are both surprising and dismaying. It's clear from history and from this experiment that authorities have a powerful impact on the choices and actions of others. In Milgram's experiment, in which over 60% of the subjects were willing to deliver continued, intense, and dangerous levels of shock to a kicking, screeching, pleading subject simply because of an authority figure, in this case a scientist, directed them to do so. So this all sounds really, really bad and dark, but there's some good news. And I want to point out an article by Matthew Hollander, a sociology PhD. He wrote an article for HuffPost, and he says, the unilateral focus on the dark side of the Milgram experiment has had the unintended effect of blinding us to one of the most obvious and inspiring features of the experiment. It also showed that hundreds of ordinary people, though the minority of Milgram's participants, did in fact have what it takes to stand up for what is right. Hollander suggests that those who stood up for what is right had certain attributes and qualities. He says, counterintuitively, both the obedient and defiant groups of participants used the same 6 resistance techniques. However, the groups radically differed in how often they used them. He goes on to suggest that those who defied participation in the experiment, which he calls Milgramesque heroes, had teachable qualities. In addition to what individual native courage and decisiveness contribute, Milgram-esque heroes have expertise at a discrete set of rhetorical skills for effectively coping with an unethical course of action directed by an authority. Moreover, he says, this is a skill set that, once clearly identified, is easily teachable for purposes of empowering victims or potential victims of toxic authority-subordinate relationships. Real-world situations with Milgram-esque relevance may include not only the notorious political and military atrocities mentioned above, but also more commonplace events. In sum, what distinguishes Milgram's heroes from the rest of us is largely a teachable competency at resisting questionable authority. As with any other skill set, much, though not all, of what it takes to be a hero is effective instruction and practice. As Labate suggests, people ought to withdraw their consent to tyranny. The tyrant has nothing more than the power that you confer upon him to destroy you. Where has he acquired enough eyes to spy upon you if you do not provide them yourselves? How can he have so many arms to beat you with if he does not borrow them from you? The feet that trample down your cities, where does he get them if they are not your own? How does he have any power over you except through you? How would he dare assail you if he had no cooperation from you? Then he provides these inspiring words. He says, "Resolve to serve no more, and you are at once freed. I do not ask that you place hands upon the tyrant to topple him over, but simply that you support him no longer. Then you will behold him like a great colossus whose pedestal has been pulled away, fall of his own weight, and break in pieces." And I've read that quote twice because I think it's very powerful. Resolve to serve no more. And it's not a violent action. It's simply a refusal to comply. Facing the devastating and seemingly overwhelming power of the modern state, how can a free and very different world be brought about? How in the world can we get from here to there, from a world of tyranny to a world of freedom? The answer is you. Get your priorities straight. Have a coherent moral philosophy. Be aware of the constant creep of tyranny and refuse to participate. It is not a violent action, but a peaceable refusal to engage, an act of civil disobedience. I hope you found this to be an interesting discussion, and if you want to learn more, I'll link to some resources in the show notes. I would also note that there are numerous replications and variations of the Milgram experiment, most of which yielded similar results. The Discovery Channel aired a segment called How Evil Are You? It was a segment of curiosity, aired on October 30th, 2011, and the episode was hosted by Eli Roth, who produced similar results to the original Milgram experiment, though the highest voltage used in this replication was 165 volts rather than 450 volts. And interestingly, Roth added a segment in which a second person, an actor in the room, would defy the authority ordering the shocks, finding more often than not that the subjects would stand up to the authority figure in this case. So, where there was a cohort who stood up to authority, the subject of the experiment was more likely to stand up to the authority as well. So just having another like-minded person in the room refusing to engage gave the subject the courage to resist as well. There are also a few other media depictions of the experiment, which I'll link to in the show notes. The Heist is a 2006 TV special that features the reenactment of the Milgram experiment. Authority is an episode of Law and Order. Special Victims Unit, which was inspired by the Milgram experiment. And Experimenter was a 2015 film about Milgram, and it was screened at the 2015 Sundance Film Festival. So once again, I'll link to those resources in the show notes. But for now, that's where we're going to leave this episode. Thank you for tuning in, as always. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did enjoy the show, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to help us spread the message of freedom. I look forward to talking with you again next week when I'll discuss the question, do innocent people plead guilty? And if so, why? Until then, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.